think it's the worst part. Once you've gone down to Tasmania, but it's kind of like respect, and then, anyway, so that's
Right, good afternoon everyone. Welcome to the Southern Centre for Inequalities Studies Interdisciplinary Inequality Seminar, which today is on climate crisis and inequality. We're thrilled to have Rick Nimbura and Brian Kamanzi. Rick is our speaker and Brian is our discussant today. This is the penultimate in our Interdisciplinary Inequality Seminar Series for 2019. And the seminar series is a really important part of the broader research that we do. The SAS, for those of you who don't know, was established exactly 2 years ago in October 2017 to be a home for interdisciplinary inequality studies in the Global South. And our central question is to understand the forces of power that produce and reproduce inequality, and to identify ways that inequality can be overcome. And it's in that spirit that we present today's seminar too. I have two small bits of housekeeping. The first is there's a sign-up sheet going around. If you'd like to sign up to our mailing list for future events, please sign up, or you can visit our website. There's a form which you can sign up so you can stay appraised of what we're doing. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our chair for today, who is Dr. Iris Kassa, who is the postdoc fellow at the SAS.
Thanks, David. Apart from being the postdoc at SAS, I'm also the executive committee member on development alternatives with women in a new era. Dawn is a network of Southern-based feminist scholar activists who've been grappling with global crises. It's formed in 1984 at a critical moment when the global economy was in crisis, but we're also facing, the nature of the crisis was such that we're facing different, across the global south, different aspects of it were quite pronounced. And this informed the methodology that Dawn used in 1984 to begin to think through the nature of the crisis. And it was such that we'd look at the different aspects, so looking at the debt crisis, the food crisis, economic crisis, and it was really centering around a critique of the neoliberal architecture that was in formulation at that period and being enforced across the global south, and structural adjustment in particular, which has the legacy of which has continued to shape the context that we're in today. And this is analysis that has also flowed through our seminar series, in particular looking at the seminar that we had in August on African migration and inequality. So that was a discussion that really thought through the ways in which migration patterns were shaped by the impact of structural adjustment and economic recovery programs. In grappling with this, Dawn developed an interlinkage analysis. So this was a break from previous approaches to analyze inequalities in particular, thinking about the connections between different forms of the way the economy functions, and different ways in which these come together to shape not only the condition of women, but thinking through the impact on women into the impact on the wider society, and linking it to broader macro analysis, to a critique of the macroeconomy, the macroeconomic model at the time, but also connecting it to micro level, if you will, cases. So it was an important methodology that was developed, not only within Dawn, but African feminists also engaged with in that period. And this is similar to what we're currently also dealing with in terms of the inequality studies framework, so thinking around the multi-dimensional approach. It runs through and has influenced in many spaces policy frameworks. But in every generation also has to confront contemporary formations or expressions of the crisis. And as we're facing it today, in this current moment, the climate crisis in particular forces us to think about historicizing and contextualizing the form that inequalities in particular have manifested. as we're seeing in the African region, but not only in the African region, but in a way also grounding it, not just focusing on, if you will, abstract kind of ideas, but very much connected to not just the concrete impacts, but the ways in which, if you will, collectives organizing on the ground, thinking through alternatives to the neoliberal approaches to dealing with the crisis. As manifested in the Rio +20 conference, it was the early days in which we began to see this expression of a green economy narrative as an attempt to kind of greenwash market-based solutions to intervene in the climate crisis. Building on from that, the environmental justice movement has been engaging on this and deliberating and articulating their own alternatives. And in a way, it's a contestation between, if you will, varied epistemologies. So in order to ground the discussions on this, we've invited Ruth Nyambura, who is a feminist political ecologist based in Nairobi. She's had 10 years of experience building in the climate justice movement, in the environmental justice movement, engaging with a focus on food justice, and as a feminist political ecologist has not only worked at looking at it from a national prism, but also transnationally, which is a critical aspect of how the climate justice movement has also been thinking through and engaging in the global processes, and also in terms of its organizing, which very much speaks to the feminist principle of transnational feminism that's grounded in local struggles. She's been the head of advocacy for the African Biodiversity Network, which was the initial host of the Alliance of Food Sovereignty in Africa, which she will also be sharing with us experiences, knowledge, and understanding that was built in those spaces. She's currently also a member of the Climate Justice Fund. And her work centers on African transformation, agrarian transformation, in Africa. She holds an LLM in comparative law, economics, and finance, which she got from the University of Turin. We also have Brian Kamanzi, a discussant, who is an independent researcher at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. He also has worked with the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research and a broad spectrum of issues under the banner of the Just Transition. He also ran a popular education project called the Alternative Energy Popular Education Program in Cape Town. So thank you so much to both our speakers for taking the time, making yourselves available and engaging in this space, and we look forward to how we can also draw on what you'll share with us to think through these questions as we move forward. Thank you.
Hi everyone, is it okay if I sit or do you prefer that I sit? How's this working? Thank you so much for coming to listen to us. It's such a pleasure to be back in South Africa. Quite a number of environmental justice, ecological justice movements based in South Africa have been part of my wider and greater political formation. To mention just a few groundwork, South Africa based in Durban, as well as quite a number of feminist spaces, WAMI and the Southern Africa Women's Assembly. So it is a pleasure to be back in this particular space and to engage with Brian and his discussants. So I will start my presentation. A week or so before the beginning of the UN Climate Conference, COP22 in Marrakesh, Morocco, protests erupted in Al Hoceima in northern Morocco after the death of a local fish seller, Mohsen Fikri. He was crushed to death inside a garbage truck belonging to the local authorities as he attempted to take back his fish which they had confiscated. These protests were not only concentrated in the Rif region of Morocco, where Al Hoceima is located. Thousands of Moroccans marched in faraway cities such as Casablanca, Safi, and Marrakesh, demanding justice for his state-sponsored murder, as they called it, and for wider social, political, and economic rights. The Moroccan government signed a fishing deal with the European Union in 2014, which gave tremendous fishing rights to 11 EU countries over the Moroccan coast for the low price tag of 30 million euros per year. This deal gives unfettered access to 120 ships from these countries, while local fishermen like Mohsen Fikri, whose livelihoods depend on the little fish that is left by the EU trawlers, are left to contend with a ruthless police force that denies them access to the ocean to fish and criminalizes their informal trade, often confiscating their fish and destroying their markets. These same small-scale fishermen are dealing with the impacts of a changing climate on their coasts, which multiplies the effects of the socio-economic inequalities that trade agreements such as this one with the EU present to them. By the time COP22 began in Marrakesh that November in 2016, there were daily solidarity protests all over the country over Mohsen's death, and by extension the plight of small-scale fishermen in Morocco. At this point, the climate meeting itself had become a serious point of contention and was heavily criticized amongst protesting Moroccans, most of the ones in Marrakesh, where the conference was being held. They called it a greenwashing exercise for local and international elites, as well as corporations. In one protest, a female protester famously held up a banner, and on it were the words, "Welcome to COP22, we grind people here," in reference to the crude and cruel way in which Mohsen Fikri had met his death. So that was one of the female protesters in Morocco, speaking not just about the death of Mohsen Fikri, but of course, speaking about the fact that the International Climate Conference was being held in Morocco, yet the International Climate Meeting didn't give any, wasn't particularly engaged with the politics of what was going on in this particular country. And this picture for me was very vivid, being in that particular conference, in showing how the complete disconnect between international climate negotiations and the lived realities of people, not just of protesters like her, but of Mohsen Fikri, and as I said, of the small-scale fishermen, not just in Morocco, but across the world. So, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has had to contend with two particular issues in the last few years. The first of all being the fact that they've suffered a crisis of legitimacy. Since Copenhagen, the debacle in 2009, which is a decade ago, the international climate negotiations have suffered from two main problems. The first being a serious and legitimate PR crisis, with many individual activists and grassroots movements, mostly in the global south, labeling it a talk show, and the people who attend these meetings, like me, being referred to as nothing more than climate conference tourists. Just like the alternative climate meeting in Imida in Morocco back here, people all over the world have been making the connections between the various manifestations of the environmental and democratic crisis that they face, such as energy poverty, drought, and famine, and have rightfully felt that the responses from within the United Framework Convention on Climate Change have not only been inadequate, but have also exacerbated the crisis. This crisis of confidence and legitimacy has to a large extent played out by having many activists, movement leaders, and grassroots movements largely located in the global south, such as La Via Campesina and Friends of the Earth, boycotting the space entirely or trimming their delegations. Additionally, these groups and individuals constantly subject the UN climate process to scathing but legitimate public critique, most of it leveled against the aggressive push for market-based mechanisms as solutions to the climate crisis, a position they deem unacceptable and a way to allow corporations and developed countries that are most responsible for climate change to not only outsource adaptation and mitigation efforts to poor countries, but to also disturbingly benefit financially from the crisis that they have benefited for. 4 particular narratives emerge within the UN Climate Conference in terms of mainstream framings of climate change. The first frame is the framing of climate change through a narrow set of technological and financial innovations such as geoengineering and carbon markets. The second mainstream framing is the framing of climate change in terms of national security and securitization discourse and migration closed border politics that appeals to eco-fascists, not just in the global north, but also in the global south. In 2008, the European Commission released a report in which they labeled climate change as a threats multiplier, suggesting that it will begin to exacerbate global security tensions. Increasingly, the social policy issues of food, water, and energy, for example, are being recast as security issues, and tellingly, climate change is being reframed as a security threat rather than a global environmental justice question, which has serious implications for those of us in the global south. It increasingly feels that governments in the global north have given up on addressing climate change and are more focused on dealing with the impacts of the climate crisis. For sure, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with the hypothesis that climate change may amplify security threats, but the problem is the framing of this particular narrative. To give an example, terms such as climate emergency, which have gained currency in recent years, are both unhelpful and dangerous, not just because of the history of the declaration of states of emergencies across the world, which have shown that there have been an expansion of the repressive state power and militarized action. In a time of growing fascism across the world, we must ask ourselves if this term, such as climate emergency, we must ask ourselves if terms such as climate emergency are truly liberating and radical, and more so for many poor and marginalized people, indigenous people, and frontline communities who already face the brutal threat of criminalization as well as arrests. But declaring a state of emergency also says little about exactly what kind of climate action is necessary as well as possible. Given that the political climate for climate action globally favors false technological and financial solutions, we must ask ourselves, does the language speak to the current politics, and whose politics does it speak to? Is it the politics of global grassroots environmental justice movement, or does it speak to the politics of corporations which want to benefit from the crisis that they have created, or a more militarized world with repressive states? One clear example is countries in the North, West Asia, and China are buying up agricultural land in Africa to safeguard their own food demands. This is actually a consequence of using terms such as climate emergency, with little concern for the knock-on effects on local communities who are themselves facing the impacts of climate change. The third framing of climate change is it's being framed within the realm of a new global resource rush over land, seeds, and forests. And it's not just the contemporary global resource rush that began from around the food and energy crisis of 2007 and 2008 has to also be seen with a bit more nuance than the traditional classical resource rush. What we are seeing now, beyond getting land for agriculture, non-agricultural land for hydro dams, for nuclear power, are actually being framed within the UNFCCC, the climate change process, as a source of both adaptation and mitigation strategies to the impacts of the climate crisis. So we're not just facing the old classical agrarian struggles. We have to deal with struggles that are not necessarily limited to the politics of agricultural land. The fourth framing is a framing of climate change within alarmist and dystopian visions. Much of today's political discussion of climate change is forward-looking, and we hear from the science that you have only 12 years to sort out climate change. If you don't sort out climate change in the next 12 years, then all of us are going to, be in another realm completely gone. But the problem is this. This forward-looking and forecasting models disproportionately theorize dystopian scenarios. The problem with these scenarios is that they erase the seeds and the historical nature of the potential future crisis. that are clear to us now. For example, racism, classism, multiple and intersecting inequalities, economic marginalization, caste oppression, religious persecutions. So simply saying that we have 12 years to sort out the climate crisis ultimately says nothing about the material realities and conditions, the social space that many people find themselves in across the world. In fact, in many ways, not only does it erase this particular structural context, it makes it seem as if the global north and the global south are on equal terms. To give just one particular example, looking at the models for agriculture in Africa, farmers from the global north will actually benefit from a changing climate. But farmers in the global south, and especially on this continent, will suffer disproportionately the impacts of the climate crisis. So even as these framings of dystopian realities are put forward, we must ask what kind of nuances are being erased and who benefits from this particular narratives. There seems to be a radical disconnect between the governance of climate change and the radical solutions that are being proposed, not just by the scientific community. And by the scientific community, I want us to go beyond the scientific community through the international, the IPPC process. Ferial Adams talks about citizen science, for example, indigenous ways of knowing, indigenous knowledge, the knowledge that smallholder farmers hold across Africa, and grassroots organizing. So basically, to put that in a nutshell and to sort of bring it back to this particular, bring it back contextually to the continent. So when we look at the politics of food in Africa, since 2008, land politics have gone back into the spotlight. And the contemporary land rush, which is global, implicates a wider range of natural resources beyond land and land solely for the purposes of agriculture, as I mentioned earlier. Non-agricultural lands, such as indigenous peoples' territories and rural spaces, are increasingly being coveted for climate change adaptation and mitigation purposes, for housing, large hydro dams and wind farms, as well as a surging interest in urban agriculture and community green spaces. Non-agricultural forms and mechanisms of capitalist intrusion into the countryside have proliferated in the recent years. Big conservation projects related to, as Hibis was talking about, the green economy, and not just the green economy, but also the blue economy. So around forestry, fisheries, biodiversity and wildlife, as well as carbon offsetting mechanisms, have greatly strengthened politically and logistically by mainstream climate change discourses and emerging policies around adaptation and mitigation. Classical agrarian studies has theorized around the changing antagonisms in the countryside in Africa. We are no longer just in a situation where we have the clear old distinctions of the landed class together with the power of the state versus the peasantry. But now new social forces are emerging in the contemporary global resource rush and are equally, if not more vicious than the classical order. These forces include corporate land grabbers, both transnational and domestic, pervasive individual land buyers, renters and the real estate markets as a whole, swindlers, urban youth, sexifying agriculture, and I kid you not, there are in Kenya and very many parts, when you look at policy documents from organizations such as the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, there's a whole model of sexifying agriculture for a very particular youth youth in Kenya, very highly educated youth in urban spaces being told to go back into the countryside and take back the land with no consideration for the politics, the resource politics in particular areas. And also financial entities like pension funds, supermarket chains and food empires. And South Africa stands implicated particularly in the expansion of a particular narrative of food politics and food empires in Africa through its supermarkets such as ShopRite, as well as conservation projects. An average of 500 related weather disasters have been taking place each year globally compared to 120 in the 1980s. Floods, for example, have increased sixfold in the same period of time. On food especially, current climate models predict that the worst agricultural losses will be at lower latitudes and tropical climates. Smallholder peasant farmers in Africa who do not only cool the planet but feed people will suffer disproportionately the impacts of a changing climate. Various studies show that agroecological and regenerative practices have the potential to mitigate nearly a third of global greenhouse gas emissions and save 1/6 of global energy use. The challenge for ending hunger and poverty in Africa is necessarily an agrarian question, and not just a technical question, as the International Climate Space wants to frame it as. We have to pay close attention to the intersecting issues related to land, labor, markets, technology, and politics at the local, national, regional, international scales. The questions for us, both related to the politics of food and land and climate in Africa, have to allow us to go beyond the simple questions of feeding people, or the fact that a quarter of the population on this continent are hungry. But they have to allow us, most importantly, to critically think through how to change the conditions of production that keep the rural poor, for example, in Africa, poor, who overwhelmingly produce the food that we eat on the continent, and who remain poor and hungry. And this is for two main reasons. The continent continues to be a major source of natural resources, not just for the global north, but for China and for West Asia too. And in the context of shrinking global markets, the climate and food crisis makes African farmers prime targets for major seed, biotechnology, fertilizer, and geoengineering companies, which have strong stakes within the international climate process. And not just corporations, but also philanthro-capitalist organizations such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which this foundation has poured a lot of money for the creation of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. And we sit at a particular juncture where there's sort of the resurrection of the politics of the Green Revolution in Africa, hoping to sort of remedy the mistakes and the failures of the Green Revolution in Asia and Latin America. But we must ask ourselves, a new Green Revolution for whom and for what, and under which circumstances. And also, this particular philanthro-capitalist organizations are providing the necessary conditions for market expansion through infrastructure, research, and investment incentives. And so we have to think through, when we think through the politics of climate, we must think through all these particular actors who sit in that particular space. So on a sort of a final point around the issue of technological determinism, notions of technology and how technology can save us or remedy the climate crisis are very pervasive, both within the international climate space, but also because we now have the Silicon Valley in California, and in my own country, Kenya is called the Silicon Savannah, of course with no particular context, but that's what they call Nairobi, the Silicon Savannah of sub-Saharan Africa. That's a story for another day. But the core assumption of technological determinism is that technology forms the basis of social life, and that changes in technology are the single most important basis of change in society, well, according to Langer and Winger. But the problem is this: an important strategy for understanding the power of technology, whether it's technology for climate change or technology for food production or for land, is that understanding the power of technology in society, as well as how we are embedded in it, we have to consider the conditions for the failure and success of efforts to develop a vigorous democratic politics of technology. Technology seems so embedded in our lives that we do not think about it from a political perspective, rarely, except to regulate it when evidence of its risk or misuse become obvious. In contrast, a vigorous democratic politics of technology requires analyzing the social conditions of innovation and developing grassroots experimentation with politically inspired alternative designs. If we continue to insist that the development and deployment of technology should be left outside of the realm of politics, we erase the power relations embedded within science, technology, and industry, and we become incapable of truly understanding and attending to the frames, cultural meanings, semiotic structures, imaginaries, and governing mentalities that can help both develop a democratic and commons politics of technology, as well as to give space to more emancipatory and radical technologies that grassroots communities, smallholder farmers, indigenous peoples across the world are spearheading in their fight against climate change. In terms of the technologies being pushed, the first narrative around technology and finance. One of the biggest problems around technological determinism, and especially things like carbon capture and storage, geoengineering, solar radiation management is the fact that they are unreliable. They intervene in poorly understood complex systems, such as the climate and ocean technology. They are also a perfect excuse for corporations to continue emitting. There's no serious analysis of why we are where we are in terms of the climate crisis. The third thing is that the politics of inequality. African countries, none, not even this country, is truly capable of affording this particular technologies. We must ask what it means to deploy unproven and tested technologies such as geoengineering, while more and better technologies, locally owned and managed technologies, are available within our own countries. They are also untestable, you know. In order to know if these technologies, for example, like solar radiation management can work, they need to be deployed at a large and temporal scale. There's no test, there's no trial, you deploy it. That's how you learn whether it works or not. The fourth thing is that they violate treaty violations. Treaties to protect our oceans, human rights, and biodiversity. Many geoengineering techniques also have military application. Have military application and could violate the UN Environmental Modification Treaty of 1978, for example. Climate wars. Geoengineering has, as I said, military origins, particularly through the programs of weather control that were deployed by the US Army and used in the Vietnam War. And it continues to be a focus for military interests across the world. If, for example, solar radiation management is deployed at a mega scale, it would create a new geopolitical balance favoring those who can control the Earth's thermostat and inciting the escalation of geoengineering and counter-geoengineering measures. And I don't think this continent is at a space where we would be able to deploy any particular geoengineering or counter-geoengineering measures. If the American government decided today that they're going to put forward a solar radiation management project. And as I said, they deviate from climate solutions. These proposals take away from real alternatives to the climate crisis. Instead of going back to fix the structural inequalities and structural issues that bring about climate change, we're sort of caught up in this mix where financial solutions and tech solutions that are really not available to Africans. And we have to sort of constantly, rush to catch up with these particular spaces. And so what would be an alternative politics? What would an alternative politics look like? And I'll read again from my paper from IMIDA. On the day that the UN climate meeting began in Marrakesh, a group of leftist Moroccans, feminists and filmmakers set out on a solidarity caravan together with 7 other climate justice activists from across Africa to the IMIDA protest camp on Mount Aliban, about 300 kilometers south of Marrakesh, for an alternative and grassroots climate justice and eco-feminist gathering, as well as the very first environmental justice film festival on top of the occupied mountain. For the last 8 years, a movement of the indigenous Amazigh people of the region have set up an encampment on Mount Aliban after shutting off an important water valve that transported water to Manajan Silver Mine Company, which is Africa's largest silver mine company, while Morocco ranks as the 15th largest silver producer in the world. The Silver Mine Company, popularly known as Manajan, has been accused by the residents of IMIDA of poisoning their water sources with the toxic chemicals used in the mines, as well as draining their water reserves. The Global Amazigh Congress, an international organization which works for the rights of the Amazigh people, released a report in 2015 which stated, among other things, that the mine uses 1,555 cubic meters of water per day, which is 12 times the daily water consumption of the village. The mine has also destroyed the agricultural life, with soils also affected by the mining chemical toxins, not forgetting that a lot of the land belonging to the villagers was confiscated for the setting up of the mine. In 2011, the communities inhabiting IMIDA began what is now believed to be the longest protest movement in the history of Morocco. This uprising has concretely brought together the intersections of environmental justice with state repression and militarization, the growing power and influence of corporations, specifically those in the extractive industries, the gendered impacts of ecological degradation, the political economy of commodities markets, the labor concerns in mining-impacted communities, and the pitfalls and possibilities of popular protest and uprising in bringing environmental justice to the people. I was part of the Solidarity Caravan to Imida, and on my return to Marrakesh on the 5th day of the UN Climate Conference, I walked into the UN complex in which the conference was, in the UN complex in which the conference was being held, to officially register as an observer. One of the very first things I saw was an advertisement by Manajan. It turns out that this same mining conglomerate, which was being protested by communities for committing ecocide 300 kilometers away from the COP22 venue, was one of the official sponsors of COP22, the most important international climate environmental meeting of the year. And this clearly shows the contradictions of space, a continuous contradiction of space within Morocco. So an alternative politics to what we now have in terms of the climate crisis is we would center the knowledge of people, smallholder farmers across this continent. In Africa, 70 to 80% of the seeds that are used in agriculture are farmer-saved seeds, completely outside of hybrid seeds or genetically modified seeds. And around 80%, 70 to 80% of the farmers in Africa are women. And that speaks to a very particular type of politics that we must be in tune to. A second demand would be a rejection of false solutions such as carbon markets on agriculture, land, and infrastructure projects in Africa. Grassroots movements at the front lines of this crisis continue to demand solutions such as agroecology. And quite a number of feminist movements and spaces, such as the Southern African Rural Women's Assembly, which has reclaimed the politics of transnational and transversal feminist solidarities, not just working within South Africa, which is where the movement was originally founded, but actually working across the borders of Southern Africa. In a climate of closed borders, a recouping of feminist politics of transnational and transversal solidarities is important and necessary for climate justice. And the final, I'd say, what would be the final aspect of moving forward would be a particular engagement with organizing, the difficult work of listening, deep listening to what movements are saying, deep engagement with one another, and forming those transnational bonds that enable us not just to resist, because we cannot be in constant spaces and modes of resistance, but to build alternative projects, which is what alliances like the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, AFSA, is doing in terms of building a new politics of agriculture that completely rejects neoliberal forms of agriculture, capitalist modes of agriculture, but also rejecting what is coming out from the UN climate processes that says that agriculture, that people will eat only if they have money in their pockets. The commodification of life, commodification of people. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Briefly, by show of hands, is anybody, I believe by the engineering building, if not so, I mean, or this part of the name of this building is that. Is there anyone here from the engineering and built environment? By show of hands, anyone? I think that's pretty interesting. I think that's also interesting in relation to a number of developments that are happening within South Africa. I'm thinking of some of the points that you closed on, and I'm thinking about the ESCOM crisis and some of the task teams that the President has established to address the crisis. I think it speaks to a number of things, and one of them is the confidence really that the state has in its ability in the global south to put forward an agenda and to actually conceive of ways to work around and put forward different types of solutions. We are in the space of thinking of policy and concepts that will be implemented by mysterious forces elsewhere, either corporations or other kinds of formations. So for maybe more recent students of the National Senior Certificate, who is able to remember the definition of energy? Is anyone able to assist me? So in the National Senior Certificates, which I finished in 2008, so I'm younger than most in this room, energy is described as the ability to do work. Now, I'm an engineer in my education at the University of Cape Town. There are a number of questions that we really did not attend to, which I think we're not really attending to, which Ruth has touched on in this debate, which is within the context of energy, it's work for who? Work doing what? Under whose control and at what expense? The questions in the narrative raised by Ruth center and take us to a point of departure that struggles of communities impacted by the historical legacies of colonialism and capitalist development and the accompanying economy of precarity and dependency are at the heart of the question about climate change. What this means is that we can center the ideas and issues that are animating the climate change debate in the longer legacies of resistance and emancipatory politics, which are no stranger to Africa and the rest of the third world. Within this, I think it's relevant to delineate two lines of struggle that, of course, are intertwined and often contradictory. One is the building of the state, which I think is directly related to the question of even the ability to participate in the processes that Ruth has called it to question, that operate at an international level. So in some cases, the very validity of the leadership sitting in the seats occupied in UN special committees, but also the tangible ability of states to implement the policies to which they themselves either agree or sign on to through coercion. The second line is grassroots movements, which for the purpose of this conversation would be in two broad categorizations: community organizations and autonomous worker formations and trade unions. So recent narratives and calls for urgency against warnings of the coming extinction and the apocalypse stand in sharp and uncomfortable contrast with the horror and banality of apocalypse and genocide that has been commonplace to the periods of colonial expansion and the accompanying imperialist conflicts named as world wars that have fought over the dominion of lands and worlds whose ways of life, social organization, and technological development have become interrupted and hijacked by greed and obsession to dominate and negate. In the brutal aftermath of the Industrial Revolution of the First World, both nature and the majority of human society have remained in a brutal battle for survival and periodically for aspirations of a different world. These aspirations have become co-opted by authoritarian populist governments across the world and toothless international agreements, some of which have been lifted out by Ruth today, that have shown a diminishing potential to stand in the face of open aggression. In fact, much of the carbon emissions that stand accused of the causes of climate change today are at the hands of the military-industrial complex operating at a global stage, which for some bizarre reason, perhaps not very surprisingly, have really been left out of the center of this question, is what does it mean to have an anti-war movement in this period in a way that can actually prevent and provide alternatives to the sources and thrusts of conflict. It should also come as no surprise that some of the innovations in microgrid and renewable energy utilization have come from the military space. We can think of microgrids that have been used in Niger over the very resource conflicts over the acquisition of oil in Niger, where the US military department has found that the utilization of solar panel arrays is more reliable than having to deliver and transport fossil fuels to the particular territory. So there's some serious questions that we have to think about and contend with at that level if we are simply looking at the question of emissions. Right? In South Africa, our history itself is no stranger to the contradictory trajectory of alternative energy technologies. The establishment of the Victoria Falls Power Company, the precursor to Eskom, was established on the idea that we could harness, or not we, that the British Company of South Africa could harness the energy potential of the Victoria Falls Dam to increase productivity of gold mining in the Witwatersrand. While the project never materialized, the capital raised was used to acquire land rights for conductor transmission and distribution, but also the acquisition of rights to deliver coal and coal plants across what's now Gauteng. Across southern Africa, the development of and consolidation of European settlements and the apartheid regime, of which we find its most brutal expression, found that energy production was very central to the ability to dominate a large territory with a small but loyal population. The Kunene River scheme in Angola is an example of this, whose partners include historically Eskom in the 1970s. The Kunene River scheme was a hydroelectric dam that was intended to deliver power to the mines in Angola, in a section of southern Angola, but also pumped water for commercial agriculture in the face of resistance from locals not wanting to participate in working on the finds, but also through active recruitment into various aspects of the liberation movement. What these examples, both the military and the farming examples, is that the ownership and control of the inputs and processes of production and distribution are far more decisive forces in the historical development of what has happened than the means of energy utilization. So that is to say, it's not simply a question of coal versus renewables. Later day saints of the West, such as the South African-born Elon Musk, act as visionary arms of sections of Western capital in search of new frontiers on Earth and across the solar system, along with experiments of new frontiers or new type forms of regimes of accumulation. So we think about the impacts of the multiple cyclones and hurricanes that have struck the Caribbean, and the ways in which entire national grids have been privatized overnight. But embedded within that story, so the US Virgin Islands, for those interested, is a good example of that, of which I think Tesla or a subsidiary company is involved, implicated, is the recent hurricanes in 2018 in Puerto Rico, which also affected Cuba and South Florida. Puerto Rico had lost power for 11 months. Various towns in Florida took several months to restore access to power. A lot of that has to do with the types of demographics in a particular area, similar to what happened in New Orleans nearly a decade earlier. But Cuba was able to re-establish power within 2 weeks. So I think when we are thinking about, it's not only simply the question about alternatives, there are also questions about distinct defensive struggles and also resilience. So I think the mobilization of a population in the various forms in which that is operating at present are decisive factors here in what actually takes place in crisis. Closer to home, the ambivalence to the impacts of Cyclone Idai, which failed to capture the kinds of sympathy that Notre Dame in the very same week, the burning of Notre Dame in the very same week, also raised real questions about what it means to be animated by the question of emergency and apocalypse when it has become so commonplace. Very briefly, in the minute that I have, which I'll go over by maybe about 30 seconds, I think about what happened in Cape Town during the drought and the question of day zero, and the way in which the questions about emergency were used and mobilized to install prepaid meters and in largely working class communities. But also the lesser known or less discussed ways in which wealthy sections of Cape Town responded to the crisis by, and also the proliferation of entrepreneurial ventures that sought equipment for boreholes, so to buy boreholes, to dig into land, to acquire water directly from aqueducts. Similarly, in Cape Town, when the crisis in Eskom precipitated in higher tariffs, it also fell alongside an accumulation strategy by the city, which had a change in definition. So if you don't know, the tariff system is tiered. domestic and lifeline. And domestic lifeline is a subsidized electricity tariff, right? So it's a sliding scale of what different communities are able to pay. So through a change in the definition, a different section of the working class in the municipality of the city of Cape Town overnight had their electricity prices doubled, which had the spontaneous eruption of an entity called Electricity Tariffs Must Fall, which didn't have the same trajectory as the Water Crisis Committee, which was challenging the prepaid meters of the droughts. But what is emerging from both of those spaces was this question of, on the electricity tariff side, how wealthy sections of the city were responding was to acquire solar panels to reduce their consumption. They're able to absorb the cost of the high capital cost of the panels for the short term, knowing that the deepening crisis in Eskom will mean a continued rise in tariffs, right? So within the local sphere, we are seeing these differentiated responses to crisis and emergency that are not addressing the root causes of the problem. Central question to the debate in the country around what is happening in the mines. Just transition, which initially emerges from the mines, has been taken up by civil society, but it has yet been clear to show how it will stymie the impacts of job losses, where actually economic arguments that are being made over the pricing of electricity are vastly outstripping the debates around whether or not it is just to produce coal or to pollute particular areas. But also, unions themselves are not showing the capacity or in some cases, the willingness to risk on prefigurative experiments like cooperatives and other kinds of ventures that could give us confidence that different types of reform of Eskom are possible. So the question is, what are the types of forums and organizations that are capable of actually having the power to implement the solutions and the ideas that are emerging elsewhere? And that's a question I'd like to engage with you in the question and answers, but I think that the power to transform is actually quite central to this debate as well. And I think ideas like citizen science and also appropriate technology, which comes more from an EBE space, should be understood as tools and instruments for the kinds of entities that have the power to transform. So more on that later. Thank you.
Thank you to both our speakers for those fantastic presentations. Now we're going to open the floor. So if anyone has any questions, we also have a mic that will be going around. I think one thing that has been running through both presentations is a very strong grounding for us not to see the climate crisis as occurring in the current moment as merely an event, but also to see it in terms of how it exists. It operates in a way to deepen existing inequalities that are also quite historical in their manifestation, in terms of colonialism, if you want to look at the long durée of history, but also structural adjustment. Yes? Jacqueline.
Well, thanks very much for two really interesting presentations. What's worrying me is, I think it's great that you ended with suggesting we talk about the power to transform. But in the South African case, we're up against a massive power block within the state that is intent on keeping coal. And the latest policy document that we've seen is evidence of that. But my immediate question to you, or to both of you, is what does one say to a coal worker and the 80,000 people in South Africa who are dependent, who are employed as coal workers? And at the same time, what does one say to a woman who lives in Mpumalanga and who survives by informal sector activities, and coal workers are her main market? Because it seems to me that the present, simply given the power dynamics at play, a just transition is simply going to mean the closure of the coal mines. And obviously that's in the long term
intervention you'd like to make? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for, I think this might be off, but you can hear me anyway, right? Thank you very much for two really thought-provoking presentations. It's a real pleasure to be here. And one of the things that struck me was that on one hand, Ruth, you highlight the ways in which these drivers of the climate crisis are highly financialized. Brian, you then also pitched in with militarized, right? So they're large institutions with a huge amount of global power. And then the question that sits with me is, how do these alternatives, so for instance, agroecology or thinking about seeds, how can those actually develop and build power, the power necessary to effectively challenge an increasingly concentrated, capitalist, financialized, militarized, right? Is that even a conversation we can have on the African continent? Certainly, South Africa, as the largest polluter on the African continent, is not a bad place to start. In terms of, it's a large polluter, and thus there is power to affect change. But how do these different, in thinking about movement building and building power, how do these different alternatives actually build the kind of mass movement that can bring to task these major global players?
There's no other. Yes, Claire.
Oh, can I just talk? So I just, sorry, this only just popped into my head, so I haven't really formulated how to say this very well, but I'll just start talking and see if it makes sense. So one of the things that I really liked about both talks was bringing in this a critique of the social, that you can't really deal with the climate crisis without dealing with a whole lot of social inequalities that are going to be deepened. So one of the things in terms of thinking about alternatives though, and I'm just not sure if it's, maybe one of you actually covered it and I just overlooked it, but is thinking about that, if it was just going to be that civilization as we know it is going to collapse, and we would be left to get on with our own things, then I would be a lot more hopeful, because then it might actually be quite a good thing. It might be a shortcut. But something I was reading recently suggested that the form that this collapse of civilization will take is first state fascism. That it's not going to just be that, oh, there's a shortage of water, let's see what we can do. But that there'll be a shortage of water, the state is going to take it over and send the army into the streets to make sure that it doesn't get seized and socialized, yeah. So I suppose I'm just throwing that out as a thing to hear your comments on. In terms of alternatives especially, of how do we break this?
Okay, great, thank you. I think those are really great questions and inputs we've had so far. So we'll go back to our speakers for first round, and then we'll go back again. We'll open the floor again for inputs from the floor. Thank you.
I can start. Okay, on Jacqueline's point, to be honest with you, I don't see sort of even a medium-term just transition possible. That's my honest opinion. I'm committed to the idea. I don't see it coming. I think the particular person that you're describing, and the question is how to respond to that, I think is to some extent a movement question. And I think we have to be thinking on two levels, right? The one is, and I think this was my sort of hidden agenda of raising the two lines of march, is that I think in South Africa as it stands now, we cannot give up some of the limited ways in which the state is able to redistribute certain aspects of social services. So I think that is still a sphere where it's possible to buttress certain developments that appear to be somewhat inevitable in the face of genuine opposition. So that is to say, irrespective of whether it's a just transition or not, I think some of those coal mines will close because coal is a finite resource. But also as the economic arguments around renewables become more compelling, and as they get support from environmentalist activists in civil society, it
seems to be clear that we will move in that direction as well, and that will have quite a lot of popular support. So those communities their economies will have to change. And I think a key space where it's possible to buttress that is with social services. That is to say, to not give up on the idea that the state has the power to, and people have the right to housing, electricity, water, and expand what those rights mean, which is what community protests are doing regularly, right? That is to say, even though they install the prepaid means, I reject the notion that I have to pay for my basic right to live and to survive. So it's to support that and to buttress that with defensive struggle. But the second part, I think, is the part that we are really kind of lacking the confidence to do, is to demonstrate working prefigurative models of what might this different type of thing look like. And I think that some of the spaces attached to the university are being a bit flat-footed around that, I think. Is that if there is space and resources, why are we not experimenting on cooperative farms or cooperative plants to produce even small-scale power? Because some of the solutions that are being suggested sound abstract. And how can we talk to people and suggest these as tangible solutions when I can't point to a particular part of the country and say, this is what we're trying, it has this and this problem, but I feel like if we get more support, we can actually move forward. If we're at that place, then I think that we'll be able to move to the other stage.
So I'll basically pick up from what Brian just said. And to answer Claire's question and also Ruth's question, one of the things that really strikes me about the conversation, it's distracting. So one of the conversations that really strikes me, and it's one of the points that I gave in my presentation, is the fact that on this continent, well, at least with the exception of South Africa, because South Africa has a very particular history of food production, of course, because of the apartheid and the legacies of apartheid, and also how transnational agrochemical companies have been historically situated in this country. But for the rest of the continent, largely smallholder peasant farmers provide the food that we eat. 70 to 80% of the seeds that are used are farmer-managed seeds, indigenous seeds, traditional seeds. And that says something in itself. So even the conversation about what alternatives are possible, I think that it's not what alternatives are possible. Agroecological methods of farming are actually the hegemony and the norm in most parts of this particular continent. Even with the growing influence of corporations, and repressive states, including my own country, where for the last 6 years, it has been illegal for smallholder farmers to basically share their indigenous seeds with fines of up to $100,000 US. And I'm not joking. This is what the Seeds Law Act passes in the country. But even with such laws in my own country and being pushed at commercial level or the East Africa community level, women farmers, especially because historically they've been the custodians of seeds, defy those laws. They defy those laws and they continue the business of seed saving and sharing and the regenerative practices that have been known to them for thousands of years and hopefully will continue for another thousands of years. I think the first thing is that what we call, whatever the kinds of regenerative life forms and ways of living and being and knowing that are under attack, we must remember that they are actually the norm. It's not a matter of it's the capitalist industrialist system, especially within the agriculture system, that is at the top. No, it's actually a very different model of life that is actually at the top. And as Brian was saying, is that maybe rather than a focus of what are the alternatives, it's basically a focus should be how do we build power with what we already have. And I don't think we've quite had that conversation of what is already possible within the spaces that we occupy. The second thing that in terms of a response to Claire also, is that when you talk about the collapse of civilization, it's actually actually one of the reasons why I felt it necessary to give a critique of the terminology of climate emergencies and what they actually mean. Because in many parts of not just Africa, Latin America and Asia, actually the state taking hold of key natural resources is increasingly happening. This is not a dystopian thing. This is actually happening as we speak. And I think what would be important in terms of organizing and beyond the climate justice space, and that's why I feel like particular formations, for example, the ecofeminist space that is emerging on this particular continent, is important in terms of having a broad range of movements coming together, and not just based on an identity form of politics, where because we are women, for example, it means that we understand, we share the same radical or particular politics, but more an affinity politics where we situate ourselves, our analysis, and our regenerative practices within webs of power, and not just simply identity. And I think that's very important in terms of how we organize. And I don't think we've quite gotten to that place anywhere across the world, really, but I think it's actually necessary for the spaces that we are in. And I think also, if I may say this, that I keep thinking about the South African context and situation. As I said, it's a simple thing as an agricultural context is very different from the rest of the continent. And I think more links, especially with an understanding of South Africans' understanding of how the rest of the continent, which is not a homogeneous space obviously, functions, would be very helpful in terms of building those linkages in terms of not just resistance, not just at the survival level, but regenerative models of life and organizing.
Great. Thank you for those responses. So do we have any other inputs, any other comments from the floor? So what I think we haven't yet also dealt with, and thank you also for dealing with the question of ecofascism, but also how it relates to the climate migration issue. So the ways in which, and as we've discussed also, the ways in which this can be, in a very dubious way, used as a justification for criminalizing migrants. And also probably mobilizing for some action on climate justice, but is that the kind of program that we want to engage in? So if you can also draw that into the conversation. And in many ways, what we've discussed so far also speaks to, in past reflections about the democratic developmental state. However, one may want to be critical of that kind of framework, but there are ways in which that particular set of interventions draws attention to how building, for instance, relation to structural adjustment, building the necessary social infrastructure gives you some sort of a basis to withstand the impacts of crises and not to allow the inequalities to deepen as we normally experience it to be. So this was drawing from an OSISA report that was done on the democratic developmental state looking at Southern Africa and doing comparisons. And it was a point that was raised, and the extent to which it also then has bearing on how we think through how we're entering the climate crisis, which has been unfolding for quite some time and intensifying in the current moment. So is there anyone else on the floor who would like to raise something? Comment? Engage? Okay. All right, so back to our speakers, you can also just, in your responses also just close off, please, with your closing comments. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the question of migration is very hot right now in a number of ways. I think that, moving to Cape Town, and Cape Town being what it is, made me think, and then coming to contact a lot of people who are thinking about migration somewhat differently. I'm thinking about a space like that somewhat differently. And I think it's also about us understanding what happened to the continent, and particularly to cities, as having migration as being quite fundamental to it. And that quite often, I think some of the ways in which left organizations as well have imbibed the concept of the nation in an uncritical manner has confused the ways in which social processes at a local level have actually unfolded. So that is to say, the idea idea of who is a migrant in Cape Town is not simply a national question. They're almost internal, it almost still works in the apartheid frame. They're almost still internal nations that are in conflict with each other. It's almost how sometimes local politicians even speak, or how people represent themselves or represent their distinction to other communities. So I think that the question about migration is not simply the question about what happens within other countries, but it's still a question that is open-ended, because the question of how the state is forming in Africa and how the nation has not formed is still left open-ended, right? And I think that in building alternatives, we need to build organizations that present a different kind of politics, right? So if I'm talking about, let's say, cooperatives or whatever, are we developing organizations that show that we have solidarity across different lines that make more sense for where we want to be? So that is to say that if it's food, if there are particular things that we want to grow or want to work on, are we building links with other parts of the continent and the rest of the world who will help us grow expertise, but also capacity and networks for distribution, where it's possible for us to build confidence and strength in those areas, right? And through building those kinds of organizations, we're also generating a different kind of image of what we want our society to look like, you know, because people are moving. So I think at the moment, and this is the danger of what I said earlier about the need to defend some of the services that the state provides, because the game that the state is playing with the limited resources is constantly generating narratives of scarcity, and then having the last trump card, if it's really in trouble, is the fake idea of resource nationalism. So to say, like, we will nationalize the mine when it's in trouble, in defiance of things that we already know, that we don't have capacity to do certain kinds of things, but it's able to tap into a certain type of populism that has currency within us, you know. So I think it's the only way you can really defeat something like that is by having organizations that represent a different image, but also that have the confidence to challenge some of the notions that are emerging, coming largely out of the ruling class, you know, to show them as being false by demonstrating the contradictions.
Thank you so much.
One of the things that, I mean, on the conversation around eco-fascism, sometimes it almost seems antithetical to one another when we think about it. But I think we continue to really not see how the right is really, really good at deploying radical language or justice language to their own particular benefits. When you look at particular research and studies, you find that, for example, in the US, when it comes to quite a number of Republicans who believe in climate change and climate science, surprisingly, it's not for the benefit of the poor and marginalized, even within the United States or within the global South. It's for closed border policies. So fix climate change, but close off so that the black and brown bodies are not able to cross the borders. So I guess we must ask ourselves, what is our radical vision? I think we sort of always have to go back to that. What is our radical vision for the world? You know, is a closed border policy. I have to pause but is a closed border policy in line with our radical visions of liberation and justice, and not just climate justice. I really want to say that. It's not just about climate justice, because as I said, it is important for me to link and to center climate justice, not just climate change, but climate justice within a broader set of issues. And I personally do not think that ecological justice and fascism are compatible with one another. I think they're antithetical. But as Brian says, we have to think much more clearer about, as I said, one, the politics of securitization. What does it mean? You know, and not just securitization around securitization, surveillance, and not just at the level of climate justice or borders, but quite a number of things are already happening within particular spaces, social spaces, that we need to actively think about. What are the full implications of it when you take it to its logical end? And maybe as a final thing, again, I would say this. It's very naive and very problematic when we talk about the impacts of the climate crisis in Africa to completely dislodge or erase what it builds on. One of the things, for example, when you look at the agrarian crisis on this continent, it's impossible to talk about it without talking about the legacies of colonialism, and how it has continues to shape, the land and food and water nexus and crisis on this particular continent. In addition to that, it's impossible to talk about the climate agrarian crisis without talking about the impact of structural adjustment programs. I, for one, argue that what we are seeing with the new technologies around the new green revolution in Africa actually basically build on the destruction that was caused by structural adjustment programs. The erosion of the public, and the state in very particular ways, as Brian keeps on saying that, the need to actually fight for particular provisions, social provisions that the state provides. Very many of us, some of the things that are available to South Africans, I can assure you, there are things that are not available to us. And I can see basically the importance of protecting the little that we have in terms of fending off particular dystopian scenarios. This is the first time I'm going to use dystopian scenarios, but I think there's an importance to that. But we have to historicize the space and the context that we're in. If not, we risk having half-baked narratives of the crisis, and of course it becomes really impossible to organize if we're not able to actually articulate the context that we're in.
Thank you so much. I think the closing statement from Ruth runs up a particular problem that we're faced with, and it really speaks to the main, another running theme between both speakers was talking about how very much steeped in politics and in the social relations that all of these crises are embedded in. But in many ways, it also speaks to the way we are thinking about the digital economy even. It also has this technological determinism that runs through it, and the ways in which it also fudges out the idea of thinking through politics. So, thank you so much for being with us and engaging in these discussions with us. Thank you to David Francis, and Tabi Mofokeng, and Arabo Ewinyo, who is our social media person and events coordinator, keeping us, making sure that we're covered, not just, the event was is being covered live stream, so we're not only engaging we're not talking to ourselves in a talk shop kind of setting, but also our conversations are echoing with networks and partners across the world. And as I said earlier, this is a collaborative event with development alternatives with women in a new era. And this is really important to have these kinds of collaborative events and conversations that are very much grounded and has been running through all the discussions around history in particular, but also context and specificities around which the ways in which the climate crisis itself also forces us to think through not just oversimplification of problems as we see them, but the ways in which, as has come up towards the end, the question of appropriation. But also the global context we're in is not the same as we faced it in the 1980s and 1990s. We're not facing the same kind of, the kind of dominance of corporate power is expressing itself, particularly also as has been elaborated in the earlier presentation by Ruth, in global policy-making spaces, in the national spaces, and in terms of also how capital itself is operating. But this also sets the context in which people are not just responding, but creating alternatives. And if we're really serious about building alternatives, we'd have to engage with the particular ways that Dallas has manifested. So thank you so much for attending, and we look forward to engaging with you more in events like this. Thank you.